Hello, everyone. This is George Will. Tonight, there is a moment of reckoning unfolding inside Republican politics, and what it reveals changes everything about how power, loyalty, and leverage actually work in Washington. For years, the relationship between Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell defined the modern Republican Party, not because they trusted one another, not because they shared instincts or temperament, but because each controlled something the other needed. And that kind of alliance only lasts as long as the balance holds. Before we go further, subscribe right now, because what you're about to hear is not being explained clearly anywhere else. This is not about gossip or personality clashes. This is about how political systems behave when pressure rises, when risk accumulates, and when institutional actors quietly decide it's time to step back. For years, Trump's political strength came from a simple equation. He energized voters at a scale few politicians ever achieve. He commanded attention. He could punish dissent and reward loyalty. McConnell, meanwhile, controlled procedure, calendars, committees, votes. He understood the Senate the way an engineer understands a machine. Their alliance worked because it was mutually beneficial. But here's the part people miss. That arrangement depended on stability, on predictability, on the assumption that the cost of association would remain lower than the cost of separation. Once that assumption begins to erode, the relationship changes, even if no one announces it publicly. An erosion doesn't happen overnight. It happens in increments, in tone shifts, in carefully worded statements, in moments where silence replaces intervention. Think about that. After January 6th, McConnell made a public statement condemning Trump's conduct. At the same time, he voted in a way that avoided immediate rupture. That combination confused many observers, but it makes sense when you understand McConnell's operating philosophy. He separates moral judgment from institutional risk management. He condemns behavior when he must, and he preserves procedural stability when he can. But preservation is not the same as protection. From that point forward, Trump's relationship with Senate leadership entered a new phase. The automatic defenses softened. The language became more conditional. The willingness to absorb political damage diminished. And that's the moment where leverage starts to slip. Short sentences matter here. Leverage is perception. Perception drives behavior. Behavior shapes outcomes. Trump's power has always relied on the belief that crossing him carried consequences, primary challenges, media attacks, base outrage. But leverage weakens when the costs of staying aligned begin to outweigh the costs of walking away, and that calculation is different for senators than it is for activists. Senators think in terms of 6-year cycles, donor networks, state-level coalitions, institutional memory. They watch trends slowly and adjust before the public narrative catches up. You have to ask why McConnell, more than most, would be sensitive to that shift, because McConnell has seen this movie before. He watched Richard Nixon lose institutional support, not because of one revelation, but because of cumulative exposure. He watched presidents become liabilities rather than assets. And he learned that institutions survive by detaching early, not late. This isn't personal, it's structural. When Trump's legal challenges multiplied, when electoral performance became inconsistent, when donor enthusiasm fragmented, the risk profile changed. McConnell didn't need a dramatic confrontation to respond. He needed only to stop intervening, and that's often the loudest signal of all. No rescue operation, no procedural shield, no last-minute save. This is how power recedes in Washington, quietly, methodically, without spectacle. If this were anyone else, analysts would call it obvious. But Trump's dominance over the political conversation has masked the underlying mechanics. Attention does not equal control. Volume does not equal authority. Institutions run on rules, not rallies. And McConnell understands rules better than almost anyone. That's why the real story here isn't a hypothetical phone call or a dramatic exchange. It's the absence of one. It's the realization that there is no longer an expectation of intervention, that when pressure builds, the system will not bend in the same way it once did. Think about the implications of that. For lawmakers, it means they reassess risk, they hedge, they soften language, they prepare for multiple futures. For donors, it means diversification. Money moves quietly before narratives shift. For strategists, it means contingency planning. Who leads next? Who fills the vacuum? Who can stabilize the coalition? This is not chaos. It's adaptation. Morally, some will see this as abandonment. Politically, others will see it as inevitability. Institutionally, it is simply how systems preserve themselves when a central figure becomes unpredictable. And unpredictability is the one thing institutions fear most. Trump thrives on unpredictability. It energizes supporters and keeps opponents off balance. But institutions crave the opposite. They crave routine, precedent, and control. When unpredictability becomes synonymous with risk, distance follows. That's why McConnell's posture matters, not because of what he says, but because of what he doesn't do. He doesn't rush to defend. He doesn't frame criticism as betrayal. He doesn't escalate. He waits. Waiting is a strategy. It allows events to unfold without ownership. It allows responsibility to diffuse, and it allows the institution to remain intact regardless of individual outcomes. This is why the Republican Party feels unsettled right now. It's not splitting dramatically on camera, it's realigning beneath the surface. Power centers are recalibrating, and recalibration always feels like uncertainty before it feels like order. If Trump remains central, that centrality will look different, less automatic, less protected, more conditional. And once that shift becomes widely understood, it accelerates. Because power, once questioned, is rarely restored to its original form. This doesn't mean Trump disappears. It means his relationship to institutions changes. He becomes a force outside rather than a pillar within. That distinction is critical. Outside forces can influence. Inside forces can decide. McConnell has always positioned himself on the inside. And that brings us to the broader lesson. Political movements built around individuals face a unique vulnerability. When the individual's risk rises, the movement must choose between loyalty and survival. Institutions almost always choose survival. Not out of malice, out of design. This is why history repeats itself in politics. Different personalities, same dynamics. So when people ask whether this moment represents a turning point, the answer depends on how you define it. If you're waiting for a single dramatic break, you may miss it. If you're watching patterns, it's already underway. I'm not making accusations. I'm reading the pattern. And the pattern suggests that institutional Republican leadership is no longer prepared to absorb unlimited risk on Trump's behalf. That alone reshapes the landscape. It changes negotiations, it changes incentives, it changes expectations, and expectations drive behavior. The next phase of this story won't be loud at first. It will show up in scheduling decisions, in endorsements that don't happen, in statements that stop short of defense, in moments where silence does the work words once did. Think about that. When the phone stops ringing back, that's a message. When procedural help doesn't arrive, that's a decision. When allies begin to speak in generalities rather than specifics, that's preparation. This is how eras end in Washington, not with declarations, but with drift. And drift, once it reaches a certain point, becomes direction. We are watching that transition now, slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably. The question is not whether Trump notices. The question is whether he can adapt to a political environment where personal loyalty no longer guarantees institutional backing. That environment is far less forgiving. It requires coalition building rather than command, negotiation rather than pressure, and those are not the instincts that brought Trump to prominence. So, as this story continues to unfold, remember what actually matters, not headlines, not speculation, but the quiet signals institutions send when they decide to protect themselves. Those signals are everywhere if you know how to read them, because to understand where this leads, you have to understand what happens next when institutions begin to disengage without announcing it. There is a tendency to look for a single dramatic rupture, a press conference, a floor speech, a public rebuke. But in modern Washington, those moments usually come after the real decision has already been made. The real decision happens quietly when the calculus shifts and the incentives realign. Think about how power actually operates. Senate leaders don't need to confront a former president to neutralize him. They simply stop spending political capital on his behalf. They stop rearranging schedules. They stop discouraging dissent. They stop making calls that smooth over rough edges. And once that happens, gravity takes over. Gravity is institutional process. It pulls everything back toward procedure, precedent, and self-preservation. Trump's style has always been to overwhelm systems through pressure and noise. That worked as long as those systems believed resistance carried greater risk than accommodation. But when the balance flips, noise loses its effectiveness. Volume without leverage becomes background. Short sentences again. Loud does not mean powerful. Anger does not mean control. Attention does not mean authority. And that's the environment we are moving into. Look at how Republican lawmakers speak now when Trump's name comes up. The language has changed. It's no longer absolute. It's conditional. I support many of his policies. I'm focused on the future. Voters will decide. These are not endorsements. They are exits. Language precedes action. The same shift is visible in donor behavior. Large contributors don't announce disengagement. They reallocate quietly. They hedge. They wait. Money moves long before narratives do. By the time the public realizes a coalition has fractured, the financial infrastructure is already adjusted. That matters because campaigns are not powered by enthusiasm alone. They are powered by logistics, by staff, by data, by sustained funding. And when institutional backing softens, all of that becomes harder to maintain. This is not about one election cycle, it's about sustainability. McConnell understands sustainability better than almost anyone. He has spent decades ensuring that the Senate, as an institution, remains insulated from the volatility of individual leaders. Presidents come and go, Senate rules endure. That mindset shapes every decision he makes. So when observers ask why McConnell doesn't intervene more forcefully, the answer is simple. Intervention would tie the institution's fate to an increasingly unpredictable variable. Distance preserves optionality. Optionality is power. It allows leaders to adapt to changing conditions without committing prematurely. It allows them to survive outcomes they cannot control. And it allows them to say later that events unfolded independently of their influence. That is not weakness. That is strategic restraint. Trump's political identity, by contrast, has never been about restraint. It has been about dominance, about forcing alignment, about framing neutrality as betrayal. That approach can be effective in movements driven by emotion. It is far less effective inside institutions designed to resist domination. This tension has always existed. What's different now is that the institutional side appears increasingly comfortable letting the tension resolve itself. That tells you something. It tells you that leadership believes the downside of disengagement is manageable. That belief does not emerge overnight. It emerges after months, sometimes years of internal assessment. Think about what that implies. It implies that contingency planning is already underway, that future leadership scenarios are being mapped, that alternative power centers are being evaluated. None of that requires public acknowledgement. It requires patience. This is why moments like this feel confusing to outside observers. There's no obvious turning point, just a growing sense that the ground is shifting, and it is. Once institutional actors decide that a figure is no longer essential, their behavior changes subtly but decisively. They stop defending, they stop absorbing damage, they stop expending effort, and effort is the most telling signal of all. Watch where effort goes. Watch which fights leaders choose to pick and which they let pass. Watch which voices they amplify and which they ignore. Watch who gets meetings and who doesn't. Those patterns reveal more than any statement ever could. This doesn't mean Trump has no future influence. It means his influence will operate differently, more externally, more confrontational, less integrated into formal decision-making. That shift narrows options. External pressure can shape debate. It cannot easily shape outcomes inside a system built on rules, and rules favor those who understand them. McConnell has spent his career mastering Senate procedure precisely because procedure outlasts personalities. It slows momentum, it diffuses pressure, it absorbs shocks. When faced with volatility, institutions retreat into rules. That's what we're seeing now. This also explains why there is so little appetite for dramatic escalation. Escalation creates clarity, but it also creates responsibility. Silence allows events to unfold without ownership. Responsibility is expensive, silence is cheap. So when people interpret silence as indecision, they misunderstand the tactic. Silence in this context is a decision. It says, we are not intervening, and non-intervention at a certain point becomes determinative. This has consequences beyond Trump himself. It reshapes how future political figures will relate to institutions. It sends a signal that loyalty has limits, that institutions will tolerate disruption only up to a point. That signal will shape behavior for years. Politicians watching this moment will internalize the lesson. They will understand that personality-driven leverage has a shelf life, that institutional patience is finite, and that when the balance tips, it tips quietly. Think about that. No alarms, no declarations, just drift. And drift, once recognized, becomes irreversible. We are not at the end of this story, but we are past the point where outcomes depend on personal relationships alone. The system has reasserted itself. That doesn't make the system virtuous. It makes it durable. And durability is what institutions prize above all else. So when you hear speculation about dramatic confrontations, remember what actually matters. Watch behavior, watch process, watch silence. Those are the real signals. We'll continue to see noise. We'll continue to see outrage. We'll continue to see attempts to force alignment through pressure. But pressure without leverage dissipates. The era of automatic alignment appears to be over. What comes next will unfold slowly, then suddenly. That's how realignments always happen. Thanks for staying with this analysis. Subscribe, share this, and stay alert. Don't let anyone tell you this doesn't matter, because it does.